A racist flight attendant smashed a black teen's face into a food tray until blood dripped down the plastic. 6 minutes later, the CEO shattered the attendant's jaw on that very same tray. What happens next will leave you speechless. He crushed a child's face against a tray, certain his uniform would protect him. Subscribe if you believe no one is above the law. The plane had barely leveled at cruising altitude when Victor Kale adjusted the straps of the baby carrier secured to his chest. The sudden stillness after the roar of takeoff seemed to settle over the cabin like a blanket, but beneath that calm hum of engines was a current of unease that only Victor seemed to notice. His infant son, Arlen, stirred against him, a tiny movement that brought Victor's hand instinctively down to rest on the boy's back. He felt the rise and fall of his son's fragile breaths and let the rhythm ground him. Arlen's small fists curled as if sensing the tension, his face pressing against the fabric of Victor's jacket. Across the aisle, a flight attendant moved with stiff precision, tall and broad-shouldered, his posture rigid as though carved from stone. Damon Vane. His presence drew the eyes of passengers even when they pretended not to look. He had that kind of presence, imposing, sharp, and faintly unsettling. Damon stopped near Victor's row, his gaze settling on the carrier with narrowed eyes. His lips twitched into a half-snarl, as though the sight of the baby itself was an inconvenience. "You shouldn't have him out like that during service," Damon muttered. His voice was low but edged, the tone of someone issuing a reprimand rather than a suggestion. Victor lifted his eyes, calm but unyielding, meeting Damon's stare without flinching. "He's strapped securely. Regulations allow it." His voice was even, carrying neither hostility nor submission, only quiet certainty. But Damon didn't move. His hands remained tight at his sides, fingers curling into fists that whitened at the knuckles. He leaned slightly forward, shadowing Victor and the baby, the fluorescent lights above catching the lines of tension across his face. His stance wasn't one of concern, it was confrontation, barely restrained. Arlen whimpered, sensing the atmosphere. Victor shifted his weight and rocked gently, murmuring a soft reassurance into his son's ear. The words were for Arlen, but also for himself, a reminder to stay steady. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation, yet the stakes felt even higher. He had entered this flight thinking of merger deals and strategies, but now all of that was dust compared to the single truth forming in his chest: protect his son at all costs. Around them, the cabin seemed oblivious on the surface. Passengers tapped at screens, flipped through magazines, or adjusted headrests, pretending to be wrapped in private worlds. But Victor noticed the way a man 2 rows ahead tilted his head slightly, or how a younger traveler in the window seat glanced sideways before quickly looking away. They all felt it too, the subtle tightening in the air, the tension coiling between Victor and Damon like a storm cloud waiting for a crack of thunder. Damon's jaw flexed as though he were biting back words, or perhaps savoring them. The hum of the engines filled the silence between them. Then, with a faint sneer, Damon leaned closer, his breath sharp with bitterness. "Passengers think they know the rules. But this is my cabin. My word keeps it in order." Victor didn't rise to the bait. His eyes dropped briefly to Arlen, who had settled back into uneasy stillness, then returned to Damon with quiet steel. "Your order doesn't outweigh safety," he said, his tone calm but layered with warning. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Damon straightened, his expression unreadable but his fists tightening once more. He lingered a moment longer than necessary before stepping back, his shoes clicking against the aisle floor as he moved toward the galley. But he didn't go far. He lingered within sight, his head occasionally turning, eyes returning to Victor and the baby as if marking them. Victor inhaled slowly, steadying his thoughts. His instincts told him this was not finished. Damon was the kind of man who thrived on control, and someone like that didn't take defiance lightly. The moment had passed, but its shadow remained. He adjusted the baby carrier once more, brushing a hand gently across Arlen's head. The child stirred but did not wake, his small frame trusting, vulnerable, and unaware of the hostility that had already begun to shape the flight. Victor's mind sharpened, filing the exchange into memory. He had no illusions. This was not an accident of irritation. This was the beginning of something heavier, something that would demand more than patience before the flight was done. Passengers might look away, the cabin crew might tighten their lips, but Victor had seen the truth in Damon's eyes. The storm had not yet broken, but the first drops had already fallen. The storm always begins with a whisper. The tray came down fast and without warning, the plastic edge snapping against the seatback with a sharp clap that startled those nearby. Damon Vane's movements were deliberate, not careless, his arm pushing the food tray so close to the infant's head that it grazed the soft air above Arlen's crown. Victor Kale reacted instantly, his body twisting to the side as he pulled the carrier tight against his chest, shielding his son from the sudden intrusion. The motion was smooth, instinctive, but his heart pounded as though he had narrowly avoided disaster. "Move the child." "He's obstructing my tray service," Damon ordered, his tone clipped, mechanical but seething with irritation beneath the surface. His tall frame filled the aisle, and the overhead light caught the sharp lines of his jaw, tightening as though every word was a burden to him. His eyes, narrowed and cold, fixed not on Victor, but on the infant strapped against him, as though the baby were no more than an object standing in the way of his routine. Victor kept his voice calm, though the strain showed in the measured pauses between each word. "You can pass the tray through. I'll lean aside." He shifted his body slightly, demonstrating how simple it was. "There's no obstruction here." Passengers in nearby rows shifted uncomfortably. One man lowered his magazine halfway, peering over the rim with wide eyes, while another adjusted his headphones but did not remove them, pretending indifference though his knuckles whitened on the armrest. The cabin was alive with quiet unease, the kind that seeped into every corner yet found no release. Damon did not move the cart forward. His jaw twitched, the muscle flickering under the skin like a small flame threatening to ignite. Then, with a sudden smirk that curled his lips into something sharp and mocking, he pressed the tray down again, this time slower, deliberate in its closeness to the child's fragile face. The smirk was not born of amusement but of dominance, as if daring Victor to react. Arlen whimpered, the soft cry of an infant whose world had suddenly turned threatening. The sound pierced through Victor's chest, sharper than any insult. He steadied the child with one hand, his other gripping the armrest for balance. Beneath his composed expression, thoughts collided like crashing waves. He had faced rivals in boardrooms who sought to crush him with numbers and strategy, but this was different. This was not a game of power, it was his son's safety being dangled against a stranger's cruelty. "You need to move him," Damon said again, his voice dropping lower now, each syllable edged with disdain. His finger tapped impatiently on the tray's corner, the faint thud echoing louder than the steady hum of the engines. Victor's eyes locked onto Damon's. He did not raise his voice, nor did he shift his calm tone, but something had changed in his gaze. "You're close enough." That's all. His words were steady, yet the air around them thickened with warning, like the stillness before a storm. Passengers gasped softly as the exchange lingered. A young man across the aisle raised his phone slightly, angling it discreetly toward the scene, though he quickly lowered it again when Damon's eyes flicked in his direction. The silence of the cabin became a cage, trapping each witness between moral duty and fear of escalation. Victor's heartbeat thundered in his chest, the rhythm echoing through his ears as if urging him toward action. But restraint held him firm. His objective was clear: protect Arlen at all costs, yet not give Damon reason to claim provocation. His arms tightened around the carrier, every muscle braced as though absorbing a blow that had not yet come. Damon leaned closer, his shadow falling over both father and son. The faint scent of coffee lingered on his uniform, but it mixed now with something harsher, the acrid tang of arrogance. "Passengers follow instructions," he muttered, voice low enough for only Victor to hear. "Don't make yourself an exception." His eyes gleamed with a cruel sort of satisfaction, as if he were savoring a private victory in pressing his authority. Victor did not flinch, but his jaw tightened. He could sense the passengers watching, their silence emboldening Damon. This was the cruelest irony, that restraint could be mistaken for weakness, and silence could be wielded as a weapon. The storm inside him grew heavier, its winds swirling just beneath the surface. Arlen whimpered again, a fragile sound that broke Victor's restraint more deeply than Damon's words ever could. His son's small fists curled against his chest, seeking comfort, seeking safety. Victor's breath slowed, every inhale deliberate, every exhale grounding him against the rising tide of anger. The cart rattled slightly as Damon shifted his weight, as if testing how far he could push before breaking the fragile line between insult and outright harm. The smirk remained, sharper now, crueler, a spark feeding off the passenger's silence. Victor's eyes never left him. In that gaze was a promise unspoken, a warning that Damon failed to recognize. Calmness was not weakness, it was restraint, held tightly like a blade sheathed but ready. The cabin's hum grew louder in the quiet, every second stretched thin. The air seemed heavier, charged with the tension of what might come next. And though Victor remained seated, cradling his child with unwavering grip, the truth was already clear to him. A storm was inevitable, and when it broke, there would be no going back. Foreshadowing hung in the air like turbulence that had yet to strike, a silent promise that this confrontation was only the beginning. When respect shatters, violence waits at the door. The tray came crashing down with a brutal smack, the hollow sound echoing through the narrow cabin like a gunshot. In a single, cruel motion, Damon seized the edge of it and drove Arlen's tiny face into the hard, plastic surface. The baby's muffled cry erupted into a piercing wail of pain, sharp and raw, cutting through the hum of the engines. A streak of red smeared across the white tray, the blood stark and shocking against its pale surface. The sight froze Victor's breath in his chest, his eyes widening as if the world had slowed around him. For one suspended moment, he could not hear the murmurs of passengers or the rattle of luggage overhead, only the cry of his son, fragile and broken. Gasps rippled through the cabin, a chorus of horror quickly drowned in uneasy silence. A man in the middle row half rose, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the armrest for courage, but Damon's glare struck him down like a blow. The man faltered, muttered something under his breath, and sank back into his seat, his face pale with shame. The others shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting away, burying themselves in books, screens, or the safety of pretending not to see. The air grew thick with cowardice, a heavy fog of complicity that only deepened Victor's fury. Victor's trembling hands reached for Arlen, his fingers brushing the child's tiny face. His heart thundered as he searched desperately for signs, blood dripping from the infant's nose, a swollen lip, tears streaming unchecked. Relief flickered when he realized the boy was breathing, but relief could not soothe the rage that burned behind his measured eyes. He pulled Arlen close to his chest, whispering softly, "I've got you, Arlen. I've got you," his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and resolve. Damon stood over him, shoulders squared, his face twisted into a mocking smirk. His chest heaved as if he had won some unspoken battle, as though proving dominance over a defenseless child had elevated him. He leaned in, voice low and venomous, words meant only for Victor. Pathetic. Can't even keep him quiet. The words dripped with contempt, each syllable a blade pressed deliberately against Victor's restraint. Victor lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Damon. In those cold, unblinking pupils, Damon saw something shift, a stillness so sharp it cut deeper than anger. For years, Victor had built his empire through patience and precision, through controlled negotiations and strategies that never faltered. That same calm now solidified into something darker. His hands no longer trembled. His shoulders straightened. He was a man transformed, no longer a businessman or a father merely enduring insult. He was a protector, sharpened by fury and stripped of hesitation. The silence in the cabin grew unbearable. The engines roared steadily, but inside, it felt as though the air itself held its breath. The dramatic irony was clear. Every passenger knew this confrontation was teetering on the edge of violence, but none dared to stop it. A boy in the back whispered to his father, "Is the baby okay?" But his father hushed him quickly, eyes darting toward Damon like a man terrified of being noticed. Victor's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. His first instinct was to shield his son, to retreat into safety. But another voice within him whispered louder, "Justice." This was no longer about a single blow, no longer about enduring humiliation in silence. This was about survival, about ensuring Damon never again raised his hand to his child or anyone else's. The stakes had shifted, and Victor knew in his marrow that restraint had carried him as far as it could. Damon mistook the silence for surrender. Straightening, he let out a short laugh, cruel and unrestrained. "That's what I thought," he muttered, his voice carrying just enough for nearby rows to hear. He jabbed a finger at Victor, the gesture sharp and dismissive, as though reducing him to nothing more than another weak passenger. The foreshadowing hung heavy in the air. Every detail, the blood drying on the tray, the phones hidden shakily in trembling hands, the whispers that rippled like sparks, hinted at the storm about to break. Victor felt it too, the inevitability of the moment pressing against his skin. His pulse slowed, paradoxically calm, like a predator narrowing its focus before the strike. He adjusted Arlen in his arms, pressing his lips to the baby's head in a gesture of silent reassurance. the warmth of his son's trembling body seared into him, a reminder of what was at stake. His eyes never left Damon, though. He saw beyond the uniform and the smirk, beyond the authority Damon thought protected him. He saw a man who had crossed a line so deeply that there was no returning. The passengers leaned forward instinctively, sensing the air charged with something unstoppable. No one spoke, no one dared, and in that silence, Victor's gaze delivered its warning, a signal Damon failed to recognize. What Damon saw as weakness was precision. What he mistook for surrender was restraint coiled tight, waiting. The moment crystallized into a truth Victor could no longer ignore. This was not simply an altercation. This was a reckoning, born from cruelty and fueled by a father's unbreakable resolve. The tray that still bore the blood of his son was no longer a symbol of humiliation. It was the evidence of the line Damon had crossed. Victor's hand tightened against the armrest, his breath steady, his body braced. The shift inside him was complete, and every heartbeat carried the same promise. Damon had written his fate with that single cruel act, and Victor would deliver the answer. The line between restraint and retribution had been crossed. Victor moved with the slow precision of a man who had weighed every possible outcome. His tall frame rose from the seat, casting a shadow across Damon that seemed to swallow the aisle. The narrow cabin air felt charged, as though the metal fuselage itself was bracing for impact. Passengers shrank back instinctively, some clutching their armrests, others lifting trembling phones to capture what they could. A silence deeper than the hum of engines spread, and in that silence every eye fixed on the two men standing inches apart. With deliberate care, Victor unstrapped the baby carrier and lifted his infant son, Arlen, from his chest. He placed the child into the arms of a startled man seated nearby, a stranger whose shocked face melted into solemn responsibility as he accepted the weight. The gesture spoke volumes. This was not surrender, but preparation. Victor's eyes lingered on his son for a fraction of a second, a silent vow written across his gaze. His hands were free now, his objective narrowed to a single truth: Damon could not be allowed to harm again. Damon smirked, the corners of his mouth twisting with cruel satisfaction. To him, Victor's calmness read as weakness, an open invitation to ridicule. He leaned forward, his uniform shirt wrinkled from strain, and jabbed a stiff finger hard into Victor's chest. "What are you going to do now?" he sneered, his voice loud enough for half the cabin to hear. The words dripped with arrogance, each syllable sharpened by the belief that power belonged only to those who dared to abuse it. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous pride, daring Victor to step beyond restraint. Victor did not answer at once. He stood still, the finger pressed against his chest unshaken by his breathing. Inside, his thoughts stormed. He weighed the presence of the passengers the cameras recording, the fear that gripped the cabin. Yet his patience was not cowardice. It was calculation. His silence became its own force, one that unsettled Damon more than any threat could. For a fleeting second, dramatic irony hung in the air. Damon believed he held control, when in truth, control had already shifted. The tension broke with a suddenness that startled everyone. Victor's hand shot forward with the speed of a striking hawk. He seized Damon by the collar, twisting his grip to immobilize him. Damon's eyes widened, disbelief flashing across his face as the balance of power collapsed in an instant. Gasps rippled through the passengers, the cabin filling with the sharp rustle of movement as people leaned forward, unable to look away. With a strength honed not by rage but by precision, Victor drove Damon forward and down. The motion was controlled, deliberate, fueled by a resolve sharper than anger. Damon's jaw met the edge of the tray table he had once wielded as a weapon. The impact cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. The tray splintered beneath the force, plastic snapping as bone shattered with it. Blood burst from Damon's mouth and nose, spraying across the fractured surface and staining the once sterile plastic. A scream tore from Damon's throat, raw and desperate. He clutched his face, crumpling to the floor in a heap of writhing pain. The sound echoed through the confined space, bouncing off the walls and mixing with the horrified gasps of onlookers. Phones shook as trembling hands tried to keep them steady, capturing every angle of the brutal reversal. The smell of blood mingled with the recycled cabin air, a reminder that this was no abstract dispute, but a battle that left marks in flesh and bone. Victor did not move to strike again. He stood tall, chest heaving with steady breaths, eyes burning not with blind fury but with the cold satisfaction of justice delivered. He glanced at the passenger holding his son. his gaze softening for the briefest moment before returning to Damon's broken figure. The silence that followed was heavier than before, filled with the unspoken recognition that a line had been crossed, not by Victor's restraint, but by Damon's cruelty that demanded its own answer. The cabin remained frozen in that tableau, Damon writhing on the floor, Victor standing over him like a judge delivering sentence, and passengers caught between fear and awe. The hum of the engine seemed distant, swallowed by the pounding of hearts and the ringing echo of shattering plastic. For the first time, the passengers understood that the quiet man who had absorbed insult after insult was not a victim, but a force waiting for the right moment to strike. Damon whimpered, blood bubbling between his broken teeth, his arrogance erased in a single decisive blow. Victor, calm once more, allowed himself a single thought. Justice had been served, but it was only the beginning. For though Damon had fallen, the system that allowed his cruelty still stood, and yet, in that charged moment, the cabin belonged to Victor. Every trembling passenger, every recording phone, every fearful breath was a witness to the truth that had finally revealed itself in action. Justice had found its stage, and the curtain had risen. The cabin erupted into chaos. Damon writhed on the floor, his hands clutching the side of his broken jaw, blood streaming down through his fingers as muffled groans of pain filled the pressurized silence of the aircraft. The sharp crack of bone and plastic still echoed in the passengers' minds, a sound that seemed to reverberate long after it had ended. Some gasped aloud, others covered their mouths, and a few scrambled to raise their phones, recording the aftermath with trembling hands. The air was heavy, not just with fear, but with a collective sense of disbelief. A line had been crossed, and everyone in the cabin knew it. Victor stood tall, his frame unshaken, his expression carved from stone. His chest rose and fell with measured breaths, though his pulse thundered beneath his calm exterior. In his eyes, a storm raged, a mix of fury and cold precision. He looked down at Damon as though measuring whether the man deserved another ounce of mercy. In the seat beside him, his infant son Arlen whimpered, a weak cry that pierced through the stunned silence. Victor's gaze softened momentarily, the sound of his child grounding him, reminding him why he had acted. He turned his head and saw the passenger who still held Arlen, a man in his 50s with worried eyes. The man nodded silently as though to say, "I will protect him." The other attendants hesitated at the edges of the aisle. One younger attendant, tall but visibly shaken, took a small step forward before freezing, glancing toward the galley as though waiting for a signal. Another stood frozen against the beverage cart, his knuckles pale as he gripped its handle. None of them seemed willing to move closer to Victor. The balance of power had shifted, and they were caught between duty, fear, and loyalty. Their eyes darted toward Damon's writhing figure, then back to the imposing presence of Victor, who now looked less like a passenger and more like a commander holding ground. "Stay back." Victor's voice cut through the tension, low but commanding. His words carried authority that silenced even the faintest murmur in the cabin. He brought this on himself. His tone was even, steady, the kind that dared anyone to contradict him. Passengers exchanged nervous glances. Some nodded in quiet approval, emboldened by the man who had done what they could not. Others shrank into their seats, fearful of what might unfold next. Dramatic irony hung over them all. Everyone could see that Victor had been pushed past the point of patience, but none could predict the cost that would follow. Damon's groans turned into an angry growl as he tried to lift himself onto his elbows. His eyes blazed with hatred, his mouth attempting to form words despite the jagged ruin of his teeth. Blood dripped onto the carpet, staining the gray fibers a dark crimson. "You'll pay," he hissed, though the words came slurred and broken. His defiance was clear, even in pain. Victor crouched slightly, his towering presence still looming over Damon. "You already made me pay when you hurt my son," he replied coldly, his jaw tightening. "This was your choice." His words carried a weight that pressed on every ear in the cabin. From the back, a passenger whispered just loud enough for others nearby to hear, "He's not alone, you know." They say others back him up. The rumor spread quickly, a ripple of unease that passed from row to row. It reached Victor's ears, settling into his mind like a stone dropped in still water. He straightened, his thoughts sharpening. If Damon wasn't acting alone, then this moment was only the opening move of a far larger game. The atmosphere shifted again. The attendants began murmuring among themselves, their eyes narrowing, their postures stiffening. A tension that had seemed to break with Damon's fall now coiled tighter, more dangerous. Victor's instincts screamed at him that the fight was not finished. He scanned the aisle, his sharp eyes catching the subtle nod of one attendant to another. It was a signal, small, nearly invisible, but unmistakable to a man trained to see the hidden strategies in business and beyond. Victor's chest tightened as he pieced together the truth. Damon had confidence not because of his own strength, but because he believed the system around him would protect him. The silence of the cockpit, the hesitation of the crew, the whispers of support, all pointed to rot that ran deeper than one man's cruelty. Still, Victor did not waver. He adjusted his stance, his hands steady and ready should another threat come. His objective was no longer limited to keeping Arlen safe. It had grown broader, heavier, to expose what Damon represented, to drag every hidden cruelty into the light. The baby's faint whimpers reminded him of what was at stake, not just survival, but justice. A young man seated across the aisle leaned forward, whispering hoarsely, "We saw everything. We'll speak if they try to twist it." His voice trembled, but his eyes held resolve. Victor gave him a small nod, acknowledging the courage. He knew allies were forming quietly among the passengers even if fear silenced most of them. The cabin trembled slightly as the aircraft cut through a thin patch of turbulence, the overhead lights flickering for a brief second. The moment felt symbolic, as though even the plane itself anticipated the storm to come. Victor stood tall in the aisle, his gaze locked on the attendants whispering at the galley. He could already feel the threads of a greater conflict weaving around him. He exhaled slowly, steadying his breath, his thoughts aligning with clarity. This was no longer a single act of cruelty, no longer a fight confined to one man's violence. What had begun with Damon would unravel into something far larger. His instincts told him the system itself was complicit, and if he wanted true justice, he would have to fight it on every front. Around him, silence and fear lingered, broken only by the sound of Damon's labored breathing and the soft cries of a child who had already endured more than any infant should. Victor's eyes narrowed, his resolve hardening. He had crossed a line he could not return from, but he no longer cared. Sometimes, one broken jaw reveals an entire system of rot. The captain's voice cracked sharply over the intercom, a metallic intrusion that silenced the murmurs and shivers of the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. The situation will be handled internally. I repeat, remain calm." The words echoed like an order, not a comfort. Victor Kyle sat rigid, the sound sinking into his chest like a blade. Handled internally. He knew what that meant. Silence, cover-up, erasure. The battle was no longer against a single cruel man. Now it was against the entire machinery of an airline desperate to protect its image. Damon was still bleeding, his uniform collar stained dark as two attendants gripped his arms and dragged him toward the galley. His steps were uneven, more dragged than walked, yet his eyes burned with fury even through the haze of pain. Victor followed his movement with unblinking eyes, every detail burned into his memory. The sneer twisting Damon's swollen face, the mocking curl of his lip even as he staggered. The attendants pulling him back did not show compassion. They threw Victor hostile glances as though he were the villain who had disturbed their order. Around him, the cabin was alive with tension. A cluster of passengers whispered frantically, their voices no louder than the rustle of paper. Others averted their gaze, pretending to bury themselves in books or glowing screens, unwilling to be part of what they had witnessed. Fear had spread like smoke, choking every corner of the aircraft. Yet amid the silence, one man, a gray-haired gentleman with deep lines of wisdom carved into his face, met Victor's eyes. He gave the faintest nod, a gesture of respect and solidarity that pierced through the fog of dread. For Victor, it was confirmation that he was not entirely alone. Victor's arms tightened around Arlen, feeling the baby's small body trembling against his chest. He breathed slowly, forcing calm into his son with every steady exhale. But inside, his resolve hardened like steel. His objective was no longer only to shield Arlen from harm, it was to document, to expose, to ensure that the truth lived beyond this flight. He leaned toward the nearest passenger clutching a phone. "Keep recording," he whispered, his voice low but urgent. "Don't stop, no matter what happens." The passenger's hand shook as he nodded, lifting the device again. Dramatic irony wove itself into the moment. The passengers believed they were capturing proof that would save Victor's cause, but Victor's sharp gaze caught something others missed. At the back of the aisle, one attendant gestured subtly to another, fingers flicking in a code-like motion. Victor's instincts screamed. Something was wrong. Moments later, the cabin's Wi-Fi signal blinked out, the little icons disappearing from every device. One by one, passengers stared at their screens in confusion, tapping in frustration. "Connection lost," one man muttered. Another groaned. "It just stopped working." Victor's jaw tightened. He knew it wasn't an accident. He could almost hear the gears of conspiracy grinding into motion. The airline wasn't just suppressing the situation. They were cutting the very lines of communication that could bring truth to the ground. The evidence, trapped inside fragile phones, was now at risk of vanishing into obscurity before it ever reached the world. The older man across the aisle spoke in a hushed tone, his eyes darting nervously toward the attendants. "They're trying to keep this quiet. You know what this means, don't you?" His voice shook with both fear and anger. Victor leaned toward him, his tone steady, every word deliberate. "It means we don't stop recording. They can cut the signal, but they can't erase what's on these devices." Not yet. His eyes scanned the cabin, meeting those of others who clutched their phones uncertainly. He raised his voice just enough for the closest rows to hear. "What you saw matters. Don't let them make it vanish." But even as his words rallied a few sparks of courage, Victor's mind spun ahead. He knew the airline's tactics wouldn't end with cutting Wi-Fi. If they dared to silence the cabin in midair, what would they attempt once the plane landed? His breath grew heavier, not with fear, but with calculation. He would have to prepare, not just to fight for truth, but to fight against forces determined to bury it. The attendants reappeared briefly from the galley, their faces pale but stern. One whispered to another, glancing toward Victor's seat. They thought their words were quiet, but he caught enough. "Captain wants it contained. No leaks." Victor's fists clenched, but he forced himself to remain composed. Arlen whimpered softly, and Victor pressed a calming kiss to his son's forehead, a vow spoken not with words, but with unwavering resolve. He sat straighter, scanning the faces around him, memorizing allies and calculating risks. Every choice now mattered. Every witness mattered. And though silence pressed down on the cabin like a heavy blanket, Victor's eyes burned with defiance. He had fought battles in boardrooms, he had negotiated with men who believed power was their shield, but never before had he carried stakes as fragile and precious as the life against his chest. The captain's voice had declared the matter finished, but Victor knew the truth. It was only beginning. The cover-up had begun, the noose of secrecy already tightening around them, and he was the one man determined to break it apart. What begins in the air may decide fates on the ground. The flight dragged on under tense silence. Victor sat upright in his seat, his broad shoulders rigid, holding Arlen close against his chest. The child shifted slightly, giving a soft whimper that cut through the cabin's uneasy hush. Victor's eyes never stopped moving. He scanned the aisle with the patience of a man who had spent years in negotiations where every glance carried meaning. The attendants huddled at the galley, their voices hushed but sharp, every whisper like a blade being sharpened out of sight. Damon was gone from view, but Victor felt his presence like a shadow just beyond the curtain, plotting, waiting for a moment to strike again. Victor adjusted Arlen's blanket with careful precision, his movements calm on the outside, though his pulse hammered with urgency. He knew that surviving the flight itself was only part of the battle. The real danger would come once the plane touched the ground. His thoughts flicked to the passengers around him, most of whom avoided his gaze, burying themselves in books, headphones, or glowing screens as though silence could protect them. But not everyone looked away. A young man across the aisle, thin-framed and nervous, clutched his phone like a lifeline. Victor leaned subtly toward him, his voice barely above a whisper. "When we land," Victor said, his tone measured but firm. "Send me what you recorded. Keep it safe until then." The young man nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed his fear. His hands trembled, but there was resolve in his eyes. Victor recognized it. Ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances often revealed strength they did not know they had. The hum of the engines filled the void as Victor straightened, rocking Arlen gently to soothe his son. The baby's warmth anchored him, a reminder of why he could not falter. He brushed a thumb over the child's tiny hand, his mind sharpening into strategy. Every action now had to serve the landing, preparation for the confrontation waiting beyond the runway. Then, drifting from the galley, he caught the low hiss of two attendants' voices. "They'll be waiting at the terminal," one muttered, his tone laced with menace. "Good," the other replied. "He won't leave quietly." The words slid into Victor's ears like cold steel. His jaw tightened, his body still as stone while his mind raced. An ambush. Damon had friends, perhaps allies in uniform, waiting on the ground. The thought painted dread across Victor's thoughts, but it also brought clarity. He could not rely on justice to meet him at the gate. He would need to outmaneuver it, as he had in countless boardroom wars, only this time the stakes were his son's life and the truth itself. Arlen stirred again, his small face pressing into Victor's chest, seeking comfort. Victor kissed the boy's forehead, whispering softly, "You're safe. I won't let them touch you again." His words steadied him as much as they did his child. A passenger 2 rows back leaned forward, catching Victor's eye for a fleeting moment. The man's face was pale but his gaze steady, a silent acknowledgement that he too had seen, that he too understood. Victor stored the image away. Allies were emerging, even in whispers and glances. Still, the obstacles multiplied. The cockpit remained silent, the captain choosing not to address the passengers. That silence told Victor more than words could. The chain of command was fractured, bent to protect one of their own rather than the safety of all aboard. The tension was no longer confined to Damon's cruelty, it was woven into the very fabric of the flight. Victor's hand flexed against the armrest, his mind threading possibilities. Could he rally the passengers to speak together? Could he ensure the evidence survived even if he was silenced? His thoughts spun through plans like a chess master staring at a crowded board, each move leading to a branching tree of risks and consequences. The minutes crawled forward, each one a test of endurance. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting shadows across faces tight with fear and unease. The air felt heavy, thick with unspoken words. Arlen gave a soft cry, and Victor rocked him gently, every motion deliberate, projecting calm even as the storm inside him grew. His objective was unshaken: survive the landing, protect his son, and preserve the truth. Yet he knew that survival alone would not be enough. If the evidence was destroyed, if witnesses were silenced, Damon and his allies would walk free, emboldened to harm again. Victor drew in a slow breath, the kind he had taken before making impossible choices in his corporate battles. But this was no boardroom. This was a crucible, and the price of failure was blood. He forced himself to remember that truth often demanded sacrifice, and he was prepared to pay it if it meant securing a safer world for his son. The silence stretched, broken only by the steady hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of movement in the galley. Victor's thoughts sharpened into resolve. His hands tightened protectively around Arlen as he lifted his gaze once more down the length of the cabin, as if daring the shadows themselves to challenge him. Sometimes the flight itself is only the prelude to the real war. He thought pain could be hidden behind plastic, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of abuse must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The moment the plane doors hissed open, silence smothered the cabin like a heavy fog. There was no applause, no relief, only the uneasy shuffle of passengers who had just endured hours of tension. Then came the pounding of boots on the jet bridge. Uniformed security officers marched in with rigid precision, their faces unreadable, their eyes sharp as blades. They moved with purpose, but it was not toward the crying infant, nor the shaken passengers, nor even the bloodstains that still streaked across the tray tables. Instead, their formation funneled straight toward Victor Kale. Victor tightened his grip on his son, instinct already warning him that these men had not come to deliver justice. Their gaze slid past the injured baby as if he were invisible. The lead officer, a broad man with a clipped mustache and cold stare, raised a gloved hand and barked, "You! Stand up." His tone carried no concern, only authority sharpened to a point. The passengers stirred uneasily, some murmuring in protest, but none daring to rise. From the galley, a staggering figure emerged. Damon Vane, his jaw swaddled in makeshift bandages, his face a grotesque mask of swelling and blood, pointed a trembling finger at Victor. His muffled, broken words spilled out like garbled venom. "He attacked me," Damon rasped through clenched teeth, each syllable forced past the pain. The sight drew gasps from nearby passengers who knew the truth, yet the officers' expressions hardened as though the accusation were all they required. Victor rose slowly, his body shielding Arlen, his voice carrying through the still air. "This man assaulted my child," he declared, every word steady but lined with controlled fire. His eyes swept across the officers, then to the passengers. "There are witnesses. Dozens. You saw what happened." A ripple of agreement surged through the cabin. A younger man in the aisle raised his phone. "I have it recorded," he said firmly, though his hands trembled as he held the device. Another passenger, his voice deep with outrage, called out, "We all saw it. He slammed that baby's face into a tray." Murmurs of support followed, but the officers stood unmoved, their orders clearly insulated against the tide of truth. Victor felt the ground tilting beneath him, not from turbulence but from the weight of injustice pressing in. His objective sharpened. If the system would not recognize truth, he would ensure that the truth survived beyond this cabin. With deliberate calm, he scanned the crowd until his eyes locked onto the older man who had earlier nodded at him, a stranger whose silent respect had already spoken volumes. Moving with careful precision, Victor slipped his phone from his pocket and pressed it into the man's hands. "If I'm taken," Victor whispered low enough for only him to hear, "make sure the truth doesn't disappear." His voice carried the weight of a plea and a command. A trust passed like a torch. The older man's eyes widened with understanding, his hand closing over the phone as if it were more fragile than glass. He gave the smallest of nods, a promise sealed in silence. The officers advanced, their boots striking the carpeted floor with mechanical certainty. One reached for Victor's arm, his grip forceful, already assuming compliance. Passengers cried out, a chorus of disbelief rising against the theater of injustice. "He's the victim," someone shouted. Another voice cut through, desperate and sharp. "Look at the baby's face. Look at him." But the officer's eyes never wavered from Victor, as though the cries of the cabin were nothing more than static. Victor inhaled slowly, forcing himself into stillness even as rage surged within. Every muscle begged him to resist, but his mind raced ahead. Fighting here would endanger Arlen, would destroy any chance to expose the truth. He met the officer's stares with unflinching calm, his silence louder than protest, his restraint sharper than resistance. Damon smirked faintly through his pain, blood staining his bandages, believing victory was at hand. But Damon did not see the exchange that had already shifted the balance, the phone, the evidence, the voices rising behind Victor. Dramatic irony hung heavy in the air, for what the officers sought to bury was already alive in the hands of others. The officer tightened his grip on Victor's wrist, steel cuffs glinting in the cabin lights. Passengers shifted restlessly, their fear and outrage colliding in whispers and raised phones. Victor looked down at his son, pressed close against his chest, the boy's eyes fluttering open with a faint whimper. The sound cut deeper than any chain could. Victor's jaw tightened, his resolve solidifying like stone. As the cuffs clicked into place, sealing his restraint, he lifted his head high, his voice steady enough to cut through the chaos. The fight for justice had only changed arenas. Dragged into the sterile holding room, Victor felt the cold sting of metal restraints biting into his wrists as the guards shoved him toward the steel chair bolted into the floor. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a pale, clinical glow over the room. The walls were bare, their white paint cracked in places, but the silence was heavier than the air itself. It was not the silence of peace, but of control, a silence designed to intimidate. Victor's jaw tightened as he glanced at the corner where a black security camera blinked, its red light a quiet witness to everything. His son was somewhere outside these walls, in the care of strangers, and that thought alone sent a burning ache through his chest. The door swung open with a sharp metallic creak, and 3 men in dark suits entered. Their shoes clicked against the tile in perfect rhythm, a sound that felt rehearsed, like a performance of authority. None of them introduced themselves. Their faces were carved from stone, their eyes unreadable, yet their rigid posture betrayed the truth. They were not here to investigate, but to control the narrative. One of them, tall with a narrow face and thin lips, folded his hands behind his back. His tone was smooth, but laced with threat. "Mr. Cale, this situation can be resolved quietly. If you accept responsibility, the matter will not escalate. The company would prefer discretion." His gaze lingered on Victor's eyes, testing for weakness. Victor leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but edged with steel. "My child was attacked on your flight. I demand medical care for him, legal representation for myself, and that passengers who witnessed everything be allowed to speak. Anything less is an insult to truth." His words struck like stone, but he could already see the smirk tugging at the corners of the man's mouth. The second official, shorter and heavier, shook his head with mock sympathy. "Mr. Cale, if you push this further, the consequences could be complicated. Think of your company. Think of your reputation." He leaned closer, lowering his voice until it was nearly a whisper. "Accidents happen. Tempers flare. Why not let this stay in the air where it began?" Victor's eyes narrowed. Years of boardroom battles had sharpened his instincts. He knew when a compromise was a trap. This was no offer of peace, it was an attempt to bury the truth before it reached daylight. His fists clenched subtly against the restraints, not in anger, but in resolve. The third man, older with streaks of gray at his temples, finally spoke. His tone was softer, but his words carried the same poison. "We can ensure this never reaches the media. Your son's injury will be treated, your record clean, provided you acknowledge this as your lapse in judgment. One statement from you, and this all disappears." Before Victor could respond, the door opened again. Damon was ushered inside, his face bruised and swollen, his jaw strapped with makeshift bandages. He moved with the clumsy stiffness of someone broken yet fueled by hatred. His bloodshot eyes locked onto Victor, and his hand trembled as he pointed. A muffled sound escaped him, garbled by the damage to his mouth, but the venom was clear. He wanted Victor crushed, punished, silenced. Victor's chest tightened, but he refused to look away. Damon's hatred only confirmed what Victor already knew. This was not about one man's cruelty. This was a system protecting itself, shielding its rot behind polished uniforms and legal threats. The officials standing behind Damon wore the same unreadable expressions, as though his presence was part of the script. Victor inhaled slowly, forcing his rage to cool into focus. His gaze drifted back to the corner camera, its red light steady. A realization struck him with clarity. The officials might think this room was their shield, but it was also their weakness. Every word, every offer, every refusal was being recorded. He shifted in his chair, his voice steady but loud enough to echo faintly against the sterile walls. "You can deny me medical care for my son. You can deny me legal counsel. You can even refuse to let witnesses speak. But understand this. Everything happening here is being captured. Every word will outlive these walls." He turned his head deliberately toward the camera, his eyes locking on the lens. "If you bury the truth here, it will rise louder outside these walls." Victor's gamble began to pay off the moment the muffled buzz of phones grew louder in the sterile holding room. The officials in suits, who had entered with calm arrogance and rehearsed composure, were suddenly shifting in their seats, their eyes flickering down at the vibrating devices in their hands. The air had changed. Outside, a storm of voices was building, and though Victor could not hear the chanting through the reinforced walls, he could sense it pressing in like a tidal wave. One of the men in suits, tall and heavy-set, finally broke the silence with a strained voice. "Mr. Cale, this situation is escalating unnecessarily. If you cooperate, we can resolve this quickly." His words were smooth on the surface, but the twitch in his jaw betrayed a growing panic. Victor sat upright, his injured son resting in his arms. Arlen whimpered softly, his tiny breaths audible in the silence that followed the man's statement. Victor's gaze never faltered as he answered. "Resolve this? You mean bury it? You mean protect your own at the expense of a child who was attacked in front of dozens of witnesses?" His tone was low, controlled, but it carried the weight of steel. The officials exchanged uneasy glances. Another, younger man, leaned forward, his voice sharper. "If you continue down this path, you'll only create chaos. The media won't understand the complexities. They'll twist it." Victor gave a bitter smile, shaking his head slightly. "The only ones twisting anything here are you." His eyes flicked deliberately to the security camera mounted in the corner of the room. "And every word you say is being recorded. If you think silence protects you, you're wrong. The truth is already out there." As if on cue, one of the officials' phones buzzed again. The man glanced down at the screen and paled. Headlines lit up in his reflection. CEO's baby assaulted mid-flight, airline under fire. Social networks were ablaze, the videos leaked by passengers spreading faster than the officials could hope to contain. Dramatic irony filled the room. These men, who had walked in with the intent to silence Victor, were now the ones cornered by a truth that was multiplying outside their reach. Victor sensed their fear, and with it, his resolve grew stronger. "Do you hear that?" Victor said softly, though his voice carried an edge that cut through the silence. "That's the sound of your walls collapsing. People are outside right now demanding answers. You cannot cage the truth anymore." The older official leaned back, his forehead damp with sweat. "This can still be managed," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice lacked conviction. He knew control had slipped from his hands. Victor adjusted Arlen carefully, brushing a hand against the child's bruised cheek. His thoughts tightened around a single objective. This fight was no longer about him alone. It was about every passenger who had ever been silenced, every parent who had ever been forced into fear. He wanted systemic change, not temporary retribution. The tension in the room thickened as the officials whispered among themselves. One of them gestured nervously toward the door, as though debating whether to end the meeting altogether. But Victor spoke again, his words pinning them to their seats. "You have a choice. Stand against the truth and be crushed beneath it, or admit what happened and begin the work of change. But understand this, your silence is already louder than your words." At that moment, muffled chants broke faintly through the walls. Though indistinct, the rhythm of voices chanting for justice pulsed like a heartbeat. The irony of their earlier confidence cracked fully, and the men's faces drained of color. Victor held their gaze one by one, calm yet unyielding. His fire was no longer the fury of a wronged father. It was the resolve of a man who had shifted the battle from shadows to daylight. Foreshadowing lingered heavily in his mind. He knew this was only the beginning. Courtrooms, smear campaigns, and enemies hidden behind polished suits would come next. But for now, victory pulsed just outside the room, carried on the voices of strangers who had seen the truth and refused to let it die. Inside the sterile walls, the officials fell into uneasy silence, their authority undone by forces they could no longer control. Victor, still cradling his son, straightened his posture. His words were calm, final, and undeniable. "When silence breaks, even lies cannot hold their shape." The gavel struck the wooden block, its echo filling the courtroom with a cold authority that demanded silence. Victor Kyle sat rigid in his chair at the plaintiff's table, the tailored fabric of his suit doing little to disguise the tension that knotted his shoulders. His attorneys flanked him, papers neatly stacked before them, but Victor's gaze was fixed on the man across the room. Damon Vane entered with deliberate slowness, his jaw wrapped in medical supports, his expression twisted with malice. The wires that bound his bones had not silenced his venom. His eyes burned with unspoken threats. The sight forced Victor to grip the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening, as he reminded himself of his true objective. This battle was not about pride, but about justice. The airline's lawyers wasted no time. Rising with polished shoes clicking against the floor, the lead attorney gestured broadly toward Victor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice rich with rehearsed conviction, "this is a case of a man who lost control. A father who, in a moment of temper, turned a simple dispute into violence. My client, Mr. Vane, became the victim of a brutal assault." The words hung heavy, twisting reality into a grotesque mirror of the truth. Victor sat still, his jaw tight, forcing his breathing into slow, measured rhythms. He could feel every eye in the jury box fixed on him, searching for signs of the violent man the defense described. His heart pounded, but he lowered his gaze briefly to the table, whispering a silent reminder. This was not about emotion. It was about evidence. The first video clip flickered onto the screen, shaky, grainy footage from a passenger's phone. It captured the clash in fragments, the angle too narrow to show the full brutality Damon had inflicted on Arlen. The defense attorney stepped closer to the jury, his voice dripping with suggestion. "Notice, ladies and gentlemen, how Mr. Kyle rises first, towering over my client. Notice his aggression, the force he uses." The lights from the projector cast shadows across Victor's face, highlighting the calm mask he forced upon himself. Inside, however, his thoughts burned. They were bending the truth into a blade, hoping the jury would not see its edge. Then came another clip, this one uncut, shared by a braver passenger. It showed Damon's tray smashing down, Arlen's cry piercing through the cabin noise, and Victor's desperate move to protect his son. The room fell into a tense silence. Even the defense attorney hesitated for a beat before continuing. "The footage is inconclusive," he insisted, though the doubt in his tone was clear. Witnesses began to take the stand. The first, a young man with shaking hands, glanced nervously toward Damon before answering questions. His words were halting, unsure, as though he feared retaliation. The defense capitalized on his hesitation, painting him as unreliable. But then came another, a middle-aged passenger whose voice did not waver. "I saw Damon slam that tray down on the child. I heard the baby scream. Mr. Cale did what any father would do." His words landed heavily, sending ripples through the courtroom. Victor's attorneys pressed the advantage, bringing forward more passengers. Some faltered, intimidated by the atmosphere, but others stood firm. Each testimony added weight to the scales, slowly shifting them away from the carefully constructed narrative of the defense. Yet Victor knew the battle was far from won. He caught sight of reporters scribbling in notebooks, their expressions guarded. He had read the stories in the papers, whispers that he had staged the event to gain influence, that he was exploiting his son's suffering for attention. The lies clung to him like a shadow, threatening to undo everything. During a recess, Victor leaned toward his lead attorney, his voice low but steady. "They'll drag my name through the mud." "They already have. How much damage can it do?" The attorney met his gaze, his eyes sharp with determination. "Truth has a way of cutting through lies, but you must hold steady. They want you to break back in session." Damon finally took the stand. His voice, muffled through the wires of his reconstructed jaw, carried venom despite its weakness. "He attacked me," Damon hissed, every word deliberate. "I tried to perform my duty, and he crushed me against that tray. I feared for my life." His eyes flicked to Victor with a twisted satisfaction, as if daring him to react. Victor's fists clenched beneath the table, the wood groaning under his grip, but he remained silent. The defense pressed on, weaving Damon's testimony with carefully framed questions. They spoke of Victor's stature, his reputation as a commanding CEO, painting a picture of a man too used to control and too quick to anger. Dramatic irony filled the air. The jury saw Damon's bandages, but not the invisible scars etched on Arlen's face and heart. The truth was there, but it fought to be heard through the storm of half-truths and performance. Victor's turn came at last. Rising from his chair, he felt the courtroom shift, every gaze locking onto him. His voice was calm, measured, but it carried the weight of a father's pain. "I did not raise my hand out of anger. I raised it because my child was bleeding in front of me, because no one else would stop him. I ask you not to see me as a CEO or a man in a suit. See me as a father who had no choice." His words lingered in the air, hanging like a blade suspended between hope and despair. The jury watched, silent, their expressions unreadable. The defense lawyer rose again, circling like a predator. "And yet, Mr. Kyle, the footage shows you striking with enough force to break my client's jaw. That is not defense, that is rage." Victor met his stare, his voice steady, his eyes unyielding. Sometimes defense requires strength. But rage is what put blood on that tray in the first place. The gavel struck once more, signaling the end of testimony for the day. The tension in the courtroom lingered like smoke, heavy and suffocating. Victor lowered himself back into his chair, his heart still pounding but his resolve sharper than ever. He knew the path ahead would not be easy. The media would twist, the airline would push, and the defense would claw at every thread. But within him, a single truth burned too brightly to be extinguished. He clenched his fists once more, whispering to himself, "A single lie cannot outlast the truth." The words fell like a hammer blow. "Your Honor, the defense calls Jonas Trenn." The name rippled across the courtroom with a murmur of confusion. Victor Cale's eyes narrowed, his body tightening as he turned toward the back doors. The figure who stepped forward was a man in his 40s, shoulders squared but posture heavy with years of burden. His uniform was gone, replaced by a simple suit that bore the wrinkles of a man who had traveled far, perhaps even in haste. Jonas carried a folder clutched tightly under his arm, his knuckles white as though it contained not just paper, but his entire soul. As Jonas walked toward the stand, Damon's eyes widened, his bandaged jaw twitching beneath its braces. Even through the muffled slur of his speech, his low hiss carried venom. "Traitor." The airline's lawyers exchanged hurried glances, their confidence faltering. Jonas did not look at Damon, nor at them. He only looked at Victor. One brief glance, steady and resolute, before facing the judge. "State your name and occupation," the judge said. "Jonas Tren," he replied, his voice hoarse but steady. "Former flight attendant for Meridian Airways. Dismissed 7 years ago for alleged insubordination." His eyes hardened on the last words, as if each syllable was dipped in iron. The plaintiff's attorney leaned forward. "Mr. Tren, can you explain to the court why you're here today?" Jonas set the folder on the witness stand with a deliberate motion. He opened it, revealing a stack of printed emails, memos, and training documents. He lifted the first sheet with trembling fingers, not from fear, but from the weight of what he carried. "Because I can no longer stay silent." For years, complaints against crew members, especially Damon Vane, were buried. Management didn't just ignore them, they encouraged it. Gasps spread across the courtroom. The defense scrambled to object, but the judge raised a hand, silencing them. "Proceed," Jonas continued, his voice gaining strength. "I filed reports myself. I witnessed Damon berate passengers, threaten families, even mock those who were vulnerable. Each time I reported it, I was warned to stop making trouble. Eventually, they said I was unfit for service. They called it insubordination, but what they meant was disobedience. Disobedience to a culture that demanded silence. He laid down another document. The projector flickered to life, displaying it for the jury. The bold heading read, "Assertive Passenger Management." The memo instructed attendants to assert dominance over those deemed disruptive, to establish authority through visible discipline. The words glowed across the courtroom like poison revealed under a blacklight. The jury shifted uneasily. One man covered his mouth, another leaned forward as though trying to confirm that what he read was real. The judge's brow furrowed deeply, lines of anger creasing his face. Victor's chest tightened as he listened. He had fought every step of this battle believing Damon's cruelty was born of one man's malice. Now he saw it for what it was, not a lone act but a seed planted by a rotten tree. His fists clenched under the table, his knuckles white. The objective had grown larger than himself, larger than his son. It was about tearing down a system that fed on silence. The defense lunged back into the fray. "These documents are fabricated," one lawyer barked, sweat shining on his forehead. "This man was dismissed years ago for misconduct. He seeks revenge, nothing more." Jonas met the accusation with a sharp shake of his head. "If I wanted revenge, I'd have stayed hidden. Silence is easy, but I watched for years as people suffered, and I could not live with myself. I kept copies of every memo, every report, because I knew one day the truth would need a voice." The air thickened with tension. The judge demanded the documents be verified. A clerk moved swiftly, checking dates, signatures, digital codes. The room held its breath. When the clerk finally nodded that the files appeared authentic, the defense visibly withered. Victor leaned toward his attorney, whispering, "This is it." Proof it was never just Damon. His attorney gave a small nod, though his eyes remained sharp, scanning for the counterblow that was sure to come. And it came swiftly. The airline's lead lawyer rose, his tone oily yet sharp. "Your Honor, even if these documents are real, they do not reflect current policy. They are relics of outdated practices. The company has evolved since then." Jonas turned his head, locking eyes with Victor once more before answering. "If that were true, I wouldn't be standing here. If that were true, children wouldn't bleed on food trays." His voice cracked with restrained fury, silencing even the defense for a moment. Dramatic irony thickened the atmosphere. Everyone in the room knew what the airline wanted, not truth, not accountability, but survival. The offer of a quiet settlement hovered in the air like smoke, tempting yet poisonous. Victor felt its shadow pressing against him, the whispered promise of an easier path. But his heart hardened. Money could not heal the scars on his son's face. It could not erase the cowardice of silence. The judge called for recess, the gavel striking with sharp authority. As people shuffled, Damon glared at Jonas with raw hatred, his muffled growl almost animal. "You'll regret this," he muttered through his broken jaw. Jonas did not flinch. Victor stood slowly, watching the airline's lawyers huddle, whispering frantically. Their faces betrayed fear, their once smooth confidence replaced by cracks of panic. He knew what would come next, offers behind closed doors, promises of wealth if he walked away. But Victor had already decided. His eyes hardened, his objective sharpened into a single line of resolve. He would not be bought. When hidden rot is exposed, walls collapse no matter who built them. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces unreadable, their steps heavy with the weight of 2 days of deliberation. The room, already brimming with anticipation, fell into a silence so sharp it seemed to cut through the very air. Victor Kyle sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes fixed not on the jurors but on the polished wood of the table before him. His thoughts raced between fear and determination, between the memory of Arlen's cry on the plane and the long fight that had led him to this moment. Across the room, Damon Vane shifted in his seat, his jaw partially reconstructed, his mouth set in a sneer that made his bandages pull taut. Even with his injuries, his eyes burned with venom, as though he could undo the verdict with hatred alone. "All rise," the bailiff called, his voice echoing across the chamber. The judge entered, and every man in the room stood. The tension thickened as the jury foreman handed a slip of paper to the clerk, who in turn passed it to the judge. The judge's eyes scanned the words in silence. The stillness stretched, broken only by the creak of wooden benches as men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Victor felt his chest tighten, as if the air had grown too thin. He thought of his son, safe but scarred, and silently promised that whatever came, he would endure it for him. The judge cleared his throat, his voice steady. "On the charge of assault, we find the defendant, Damon Vane, guilty. On the charge of negligence, guilty. On the charge of systemic abuse, guilty." A sharp intake of breath swept through the gallery. Outside, the muffled sound of chants and shouts from protesters carried faintly into the courtroom, a reminder of the storm raging beyond these walls. Victor closed his eyes for a brief moment, relief crashing into him like a wave, though exhaustion followed quickly behind. His fight had been long, brutal, and costly, but here was the proof that truth, though delayed, had prevailed. Damon shifted violently in his seat, his bandaged jaw straining as he tried to speak. A guttural sound escaped, more growl than word, and his fists clenched white against the arms of his chair. His glare was fixed on Victor, a promise of vengeance etched into every line of his battered face. Victor met his eyes, calm but unflinching, refusing to yield even an inch. He had stared down rivals in boardrooms, enemies in court, but this stare was different. It was personal, a storm that would not die even with a verdict. The judge's gavel struck once, commanding order. The court sentences Damon Vane to imprisonment and fines as determined by the statute. Furthermore, the airline is hereby ordered to implement mandatory reforms, training programs for all crew, the creation of oversight boards, and the establishment of independent passenger rights enforcement. Compensation shall be awarded to the plaintiff. This court will oversee compliance to ensure these measures are carried out. The words sent ripples across the room. Some men in the gallery nodded in approval, others whispered furiously to one another, but the verdict had been sealed. The airline, so confident in silence and cover-ups, now faced a future reshaped by accountability. Victor breathed deeply, knowing that the battle he had fought had reached a turning point not just for him, but for countless others who would one day fly without fear. His attorneys placed steadying hands on his shoulders, their voices low but proud. "You did it," one whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Victor managed a small nod, though he could not shake the heaviness pressing down on him. Yes, he had won, but victories in such battles always carried scars. He thought of Arlen again, of the boy's future in a world that might now be safer because of this trial. That thought steadied him, gave the pain a purpose. The bailiff began to escort Damon out, but not before Damon turned his bloodshot eyes back toward Victor. His bandaged mouth twisted, a guttural noise rumbling deep in his throat, the sound of a man too broken to stand tall but too hateful to bow. Victor did not look away. Their gazes locked one final time, the air between them charged with unspoken threats. Victor straightened his shoulders, lifting his chin. The courtroom's din swelled as reporters scrambled for statements and officials shuffled papers, but for Victor, everything had gone quiet. He knew the story wasn't finished. Damon's glare promised that shadows lingered, and men with power rarely surrendered without a fight. Yet here, in this room, he had laid a foundation that no threat could erase. He picked up his briefcase, his movements calm, deliberate. The noise of the gavel, the shuffle of the crowd, the muffled chants outside, all blended into a single hum. Victor's heart no longer raced with fear, but with resolve. He carried not just the weight of victory, but the burden of vigilance. As he walked out of the courtroom, the thought crystallized in his mind, sharp and enduring. Justice is never the end. It is the beginning of vigilance. Victor stood outside the training center, the morning sun casting sharp angles across the glass facade. The building gleamed like a monument to change, its polished surface reflecting not only the city skyline but also the storm that had led to its creation. His hands tightened gently around Arlen, who giggled softly in his arms, the sound innocent and unburdened. For a moment, Victor simply watched the doors swing open and close as groups of newly hired crew members filed inside. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces a mixture of nerves and determination, as though they were walking into more than a job. They were stepping into the future he had fought to build. Inside, the atmosphere was entirely different from the hollow silence of flights past. Voices carried with an air of sincerity as instructors guided trainees through empathy drills. A man in his early 30s stood at the front, demonstrating a scenario where a passenger needed assistance. "You don't see just a seat number," the trainer declared, his tone firm but calm. "You see a person with fears, hopes, and dignity." The words struck Victor, echoing like a direct counterpoint to the cruelty Damon had once shown. He held his son closer, the faint scars on Arlen's nose a constant reminder of the price that had been paid. As the group shifted into role play, Victor stepped quietly inside, unannounced but not unrecognized. A few trainees stole glances at him, whispers rippling in hushed tones. One young attendant, his hands trembling as he practiced offering help to an imagined passenger, froze when he spotted Victor at the doorway. The boy swallowed hard, then straightened his shoulders and carried on, his voice steadier than before. Victor noticed it, and though he said nothing, his faint nod gave silent encouragement. A middle-aged man approached, wearing the badge of the program director. "Mr. Cale," he said respectfully, bowing his head slightly, "we didn't expect you today, but it is an honor." His voice carried both admiration and unease, as though he bore the weight of knowing what had necessitated this program. Victor shifted Arlen gently and replied with quiet authority, "I didn't come to be honored. I came to see if the promise was real. This is more than training. It's a second chance for the industry." His eyes scanned the room, watching as one trainee carefully bent down to adjust an elderly man's coat in a simulated boarding exercise. The small gesture stirred something in Victor, a reminder of the dignity that had been denied him and his child. The director nodded, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "We are building something better, sir." "Slowly, but it is happening." Victor studied him, the silence stretching just long enough to weigh the truth of those words. "Make sure it doesn't stop when the cameras leave," he said finally, his voice steady but edged with steel. "Change must outlive the noise." He walked further into the center, the faint smell of polished floors mixing with the low hum of voices. Arlen reached out toward the bright ceiling lights, his small fingers curling toward the glow. The child's laughter cut through the heavy air, a sound that made several trainees smile despite the gravity of their tasks. Victor paused, realizing that his son had become more than a victim. He had become a symbol of why this fight mattered. Outside, the world was shifting as well. News tickers on the large screens in the lobby announced debates in Parliament over new passenger protection laws. Commentators argued fiercely about corporate accountability, yet for once, the conversation was no longer buried in silence. Victor watched the scrolling words, feeling both relief and responsibility settle on his shoulders. He knew legislation could be passed, but culture required constant tending. He could not step away, not yet. The program director cleared his throat gently. "Would you like to address them?" he asked, motioning to the gathered crew. Victor hesitated. He had not planned to speak, yet the silence that followed felt like a question only he could answer. Stepping forward, he adjusted Arlen in his arms and looked directly at the trainees. "Every passenger who boards a plane places their life and dignity in your hands," he said, his tone calm yet unshakably firm. "Remember that trust. Remember that no uniform gives you power to harm, it gives you the duty to protect." His words hung heavy, but they were received not with fear, but with quiet determination. For a long moment he stood there, letting the silence breathe before he turned back toward the glass doors. Arlen rested his head against his chest, the child's steady breaths warm against his heart. Victor exhaled slowly, his eyes lifting toward the open skies that stretched endlessly above. The horizon seemed brighter now, though the shadow of memory still lingered. He knew scars did not fade overnight, nor did vigilance ever rest. Yet in that moment, with his son alive and the world inching toward change, Victor allowed himself a rare peace. For the first time in months, he smiled. Sometimes, the darkest flights lead to the brightest horizons. Minutes later, the father struck back, the same tray that held a child's blood shattered inside his attacker's mouth. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, cruelty, and abuse of authority in everyday spaces. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic injustice, provoke thought about accountability in positions of power, and inspire action toward justice, dignity, and equality for all.